A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Here ends the reading. I will admit it, I have always had my fears. From being a child in elementary school who looked out the window as the school day was coming to an end to make sure my mom or granddad was there in the pickup line to get me, as if they would ever forget me. To, as I heard someone once say, having a healthy respect for elevation. A funny way of saying, I have a fear of heights. What you are looking at is a lighthouse in Presque Isle Harbor, Michigan, which is near where my wife Kristen and I vacation every summer. She loves climbing this lighthouse and the gorgeous views from the top. I do not, as I hug the wall and stay as far away as possible from the minuscule rail that comes up to my waist. And this is only on those rare occasions when she can convince me to walk up those torturous steps to those views that are amazing for some and nauseating for me. I don't have a problem with the view from the ground. But this summer I decided to confront one of my fears dead on. I have been swimming since I was very small. I'm comfortable in the water. I've paddled through storms in a canoe, enjoy the kayak. But then there was this intimidating beast of a sailboat, the sunfish. I'm a 48-year-old man who considers himself athletic. Okay, maybe used to consider himself athletic. Who likes the water. And I would occasionally go out with my brother-in-law or my father-in-law who would zip around the lake as if they were about to be called up for the America's Cup yacht team. And yet in 30 years of going to this place every summer, I never had the nerve to go out solo. I was always too afraid. Until this summer. I'm not even sure what came over me. But I did it. Yep, that's me. I have witnesses to prove it. Was it the longest sail ever? Absolutely not. But for me, victory. At one point, I was farther out on the lake than I wanted to be, and the wind was starting to pick up, and I will admit, I was starting to panic a little bit. What was I thinking? Why did I do this? And like the little boy looking out the school window, I could see Kristen and my father-in-law on the dock, and I knew if I got in real trouble, they would zip out on the pontoon to help me. Then I relaxed and I caught the wind in my sails and picked up speed and was actually sailing on my own for the first time, and it was exhilarating. Today's gospel from Matthew is full of rich imagery. It is especially interesting that even though the disciples have just come from having seen and assisted Jesus with the miraculous feeding of thousands, once again providing another example for them of his divine power and compassion, they still fail to recognize him initially and grow even more alarmed as he draws near. It's only at this extreme moment of fear in the story that they recognize him. To recap, while the disciples are crossing the water, they face a severe storm that rages throughout the night. In the early hours of the morning, here comes Jesus strolling across the water to meet them. Mistaking Jesus for a ghost, the disciples grow even more alarmed as he gets closer. In response, Jesus reassures them that it is he who is coming to them. And the encouragement works, so much so that Peter becomes bold enough to ask if he might join Jesus out on the water. And at first he is walking on water, but then his fears take over. So Jesus reaches out and grabs him. And when Jesus remarks on his lack of faith, it is at this moment that the disciples see Jesus as if for the first time, confessing, "Truly, you are the Son of God." One striking thing about this passage in the reaction of the disciples is how it reveals something very true about us. How often do we overlook God's presence when our lives seem peaceful and pleasant and safe from the storms? And how much more willing are we to call out to God when things have turned difficult? All too often we assume we no longer need God, or forget how much we depend on God, or forget that God desires to be a part of our life until the storms arrive. In the form of illness or job loss, or the end of a relationship, or some awful mistake we've made, or a pandemic that feels like it will never end and life will never be the same. And suddenly our ongoing need for God becomes clear. So one thing today's gospel tells us is that no matter what reminds us of our need for God, our God still responds. As Jesus reassures the disciples and reaches out to catch the sinking Peter, God responds to us with compassion and support. And yet another striking thing about this passage is God's desire that we live lives of courage. Notice that in the first verse of today's gospel, Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side. He commanded the disciples to go ahead of him, trusting them to navigate the storm and the waves. With parallel texts in Mark and John, and as we've noted, today's gospel is often used to remind us that Jesus never abandons us, that he can calm our troubled waters as well. But I believe it should also remind us that sometimes God might be calling us into choppy waters. While my story from my time at the lake is about finding some courage to stay in the boat, today's gospel is also about finding the courage to not only take the boat into the heavy waves, but to occasionally step outside the boat. Such is the way of being faithful to the call of Christ. Perhaps we might imagine the hopes and dreams God has for us, both as individuals and as communities of faith. Hopes and dreams in which God is encouraging us to cross rough waters, and even to step out of the boat in faith, filled with the assurance that Jesus will not abandon us. Filled with the assurance that when we need it the most, Jesus will be there to catch us and lift us up out of the water and into the boat. Perhaps following Peter's example, God is calling us to step out of our comfort and security and head into the troubled waters of this world, proclaiming the love and acceptance and mercy of Jesus Christ. Perhaps we might embrace the sometimes risky, sometimes dangerous, but most fulfilling business of being a disciple. I would like to share this quote from a sermon by Will Willimon that I believe captures this beautifully. If Peter had not ventured forth, had not obeyed the call to walk on the water, then Peter would never have had this opportunity for recognition and rescue by Jesus. I wonder if too many of us are merely splashing about in the safe shallows, and therefore have too few opportunities to test and deepen our faith. The story today implies if you want to be close to Jesus, you have to venture forth out on the sea. You have to prove his promises through trusting his promises, through risk and venture. And it's never too late. Heck, it took me approaching 50 years old to take out that sunfish. And now, I can't wait to do it again. The waters might be a little choppy, but we have our life jackets. And we have a God who reaches out to catch us. So what do you say? Let's hit the water. Amen.